You're standing in the desert at dawn, and the horizon is about to change forever. The scientists around you are making bets, some wagering the test will fail completely, others calculating whether the explosion might ignite the entire atmosphere and end all life on Earth. It's July 16, 1945, and humanity is about to split the atom for the first time, stepping through a doorway we can never close again. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive, or if you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet where we explore the fascinating, sometimes sobering stories that have shaped our world. I'm so glad you've decided to join me tonight. Tonight, we're exploring one of humanity's most powerful and controversial technologies, nuclear energy, and what happens when it goes catastrophically wrong. So settle into your most comfortable position, let your breathing slow and deepen, and join me as we journey through the atomic age. We begin not with a disaster, but with a moment of creation, when scientists in a New Mexico desert unleashed a force that would change everything. The summer night in the New Mexico desert was unusually cool for July. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, a group of scientists and military personnel stood in bunkers and observation posts, watching a 100-foot tower silhouetted against the pre-dawn darkness. Atop that tower sat a device they called the Gadget, a sphere of plutonium and conventional explosives that represented years of theoretical physics, desperate wartime engineering, and over $2 billion of secret investment. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist who'd led the Manhattan Project, watched from a control bunker 10,000 yards away. He'd barely slept in days. The scientists around him had placed bets on the test's outcome. Would it fizzle? Would it work as predicted? One physicist, Enrico Fermi, was taking wagers on whether the explosion might ignite the atmosphere and destroy all life on Earth. He'd calculated the odds and decided the risk was acceptably low. But the fact that humanity's most brilliant minds were even considering such a possibility tells you something about the magnitude of what they were attempting. The countdown reached 0. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then the desert exploded into light. The flash was visible 200 miles away. Those watching from 10 miles distance felt heat on their faces as if they'd opened an oven door. The light was so bright that a blind woman miles away reported seeing it. The explosion's electromagnetic pulse knocked out radio equipment. And then, after the light, came the sound, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rolling across the desert like the voice of creation itself. Where the tower had stood, a crater 40 feet deep and nearly 1,000 feet across scarred the earth. The sand had fused into a jade-green radioactive glass that locals would later call Trinitite. The mushroom cloud rose to over 7 miles high. In that moment, humanity had achieved something unprecedented. We'd created conditions that previously existed only in the cores of stars. Oppenheimer, watching the fireball expand, later said that a line from Hindu scripture came to mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Another scientist, Kenneth Bainbridge, put it more plainly. "Now we are all sons of bitches." But here's what they didn't fully understand yet, the invisible danger that came with that power. The Trinity test released radiation equivalent to about 20,000 tons of TNT exploding. Not just explosive force, but radioactive particles carried on the wind. The fallout cloud drifted northeast, depositing radioactive material across New Mexico and beyond. Cows grazing in the area showed beta burns on their hides. Residents reported unusual illnesses. But in 1945, radiation exposure was poorly understood, and the Manhattan Project was so secret that civilians affected by the test weren't warned about what they'd been exposed to. The ranchers who lived near the Trinity site noticed strange things in the days after the test. Their animals behaved oddly. Some cattle developed white patches on their hides where the hair had been scorched away. People reported seeing the flash, feeling the ground shake and finding a fine, sand-like dust covering everything the next morning. When they asked the military what had happened, they were told there had been an ammunition dump explosion. The truth would remain classified for years. Within weeks of Trinity, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending World War II and announcing to the world that humanity had entered the nuclear age. But the testing didn't stop. Between 1945 and 1963, the United States conducted over 200 atmospheric nuclear tests. The Soviet Union conducted even more. Britain, France, and eventually China joined the Atomic Club, each conducting their own tests. The Marshall Islands in the Pacific became a primary testing ground. The residents of Bikini Atoll were relocated so their home could be vaporized by nuclear explosions. In 1954, the Castle Bravo test, intended to be a 5-megaton explosion, actually yielded 15 megatons, the largest nuclear device the U.S. ever detonated. The unexpected power meant the fallout zone was much larger than predicted. Islanders on atolls thought to be at safe distances were covered in radioactive ash. A Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, was caught in the fallout zone, and all 23 crew members suffered radiation sickness. One died months later. Through these tests, scientists learned about radiation's effects the hard way. They learned that radioactive iodine concentrates in the thyroid gland, causing cancer years later. They learned that strontium-90 mimics calcium and accumulates in bones. They learned that cesium-137 enters the food chain through contaminated soil. Each test was an experiment not just in weapon design, but in radiation biology, with human populations serving as unwitting subjects. The scientists who built the first atomic bombs were brilliant, dedicated people working under enormous pressure to end a terrible war. Many of them genuinely believed they were serving humanity by developing a weapon so terrible that nations would never dare fight another major war. And in some ways, they might have been right. The existence of nuclear weapons may have prevented direct conflict between superpowers during the Cold War. But the legacy of those early tests extends beyond geopolitics. Communities downwind from test sites experienced elevated cancer rates for decades afterward. Children born to parents exposed to fallout had higher rates of birth defects. The environment itself was contaminated. Desert tortoises in Nevada test sites still show detectable radiation levels today, 80 years later. What makes radiation particularly insidious is its invisibility. The Trinity scientists couldn't see the danger they were creating. Without specialized equipment, radiation is undetectable to human senses. You can't smell it, taste it, or feel it until the dose is high enough to cause immediate symptoms. And by then, fatal damage may already be done. This invisible quality would characterize every nuclear disaster to come. The early atomic age also established patterns that would repeat in later nuclear accidents. Rushing to meet deadlines, prioritizing military or political goals over safety, inadequate protection for workers and nearby populations, and government secrecy that prevented people from making informed decisions about their own exposure. By the late 1950s, the atmospheric tests had deposited so much radioactive material into the environment that every human on Earth carried detectable levels of artificial isotopes in their bodies. Strontium-90 appeared in children's teeth. Cesium-137 could be found in the food chain worldwide. The entire planet had become, in a sense, a low-level radiation exposure experiment. The 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty moved testing underground, reducing but not eliminating the radiation released into the environment. The nuclear powers had learned, slowly and at great cost, that splitting the atom came with consequences that spread far beyond the immediate explosion. But the lessons learned from weapons testing would prove insufficient when it came to nuclear power generation. The next chapter in nuclear accidents would unfold not on remote atolls or desert test sites, but in the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, where the rush to build nuclear weapons would create a disaster that remained hidden from the world for decades. In the southeastern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, there was a place that didn't officially exist. It had no name on maps, no mention in geography books, no acknowledgement in any public record. The 40 square miles surrounding this secret installation were simply blank space on Soviet maps, as if the cartographers had forgotten to fill in that section. But this empty space on the map was home to over 100,000 people working at one of the most important facilities in the Soviet Union, a massive complex dedicated to producing plutonium for nuclear weapons. The closest city on maps was Chelyabinsk, so the facility was often called Chelyabinsk 40, though it had various code names over the years. The workers called it the installation. Today we know it as Mayak, which simply means lighthouse in Russian, an oddly poetic name for a place that would become the site of one of history's worst nuclear disasters, an event so thoroughly covered up that the world wouldn't learn about it for decades. To understand what happened at Mayak, we need to understand the desperate urgency of the Soviet nuclear weapons program in the late 1940s. The United States had demonstrated atomic weapons in 1945, and Stalin was determined that the Soviet Union would catch up as quickly as possible. No cost was too high, no shortcut too risky. The scientists and engineers building Mayak were given impossible deadlines and told that failure was not an option. Construction began in 1945 in a heavily forested area near several small villages. The location was chosen partly for its remoteness and partly for its proximity to the Teka River, which would provide cooling water for the reactors. Tens of thousands of workers, many of them prisoners from labor camps, built the facility in brutal conditions. Some of the labor camp's prisoners were German POWs. Others were Soviet citizens imprisoned for political crimes or simply for being in the wrong place when the NKVD needed workers. They built the first plutonium production reactor in less than 2 years, a remarkable feat of engineering accomplished through methods that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The first reactor went operational in 1948. Soon, several reactors were running, producing plutonium for the Soviet nuclear arsenal. But the urgency that drove construction also shaped the facility's approach to safety and waste management, or rather the lack thereof. The high-level radioactive waste from plutonium production had to go somewhere. In the early years, the solution was shockingly simple. They dumped it directly into the Teka River. Millions of gallons of radioactive waste poured into the river system that provided water to dozens of downstream villages. The contamination was so severe that the river literally glowed at night. The workers were told this luminescence was simply phosphorescence and nothing to worry about. Thousands of people living along the Teka River were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. They drank the water, bathed in it, fished in it, and irrigated their crops with it. Children played along its banks. People began getting sick with mysterious illnesses. Nausea, fatigue, unusual bleeding, and a condition that came to be called river disease by locals who didn't understand what was happening to them. Eventually, even Soviet officials realized the Teka River dumping had to stop. The solution they implemented tells you everything about the priorities at work. They built storage tanks for the high-level waste. These tanks were essentially large steel containers buried in the ground, filled with liquid radioactive waste that generated tremendous heat from radioactive decay. Cooling systems circulated water through pipes to prevent the tanks from overheating. On September 29, 1957, one of these cooling systems failed. Without cooling, the temperature in Tank 14 began to rise. The tank contained about 80 tons of high-level radioactive waste, and as it heated, the liquid began to evaporate. The waste included sodium acetate, which can become explosive when concentrated and heated. For hours, possibly days, the temperature climbed while the failing cooling system went unnoticed or unreported. At 4:20 p.m., Tank 14 exploded. The explosion was enormous, estimated at 70 to 100 tons of TNT equivalent. The concrete lid covering the tank, weighing 160 tons, was blown off and landed hundreds of feet away. The explosion sent a radioactive cloud, rising nearly a mile into the sky. The cloud, carried by the wind, deposited radioactive material across a vast area. The immediate impact zone became known as the East Urals radioactive trace, a strip of contaminated land stretching northeast from Mayak for about 200 miles, varying in width from 5 to 30 miles. The total contaminated area covered roughly 800 square miles. This was approximately 90% as much long-lived radioactivity as would later be released at Chernobyl, though concentrated in a smaller area. And yet, the world heard nothing. The Soviet government imposed absolute silence. The disaster was classified at the highest level of secrecy. Even within the Soviet Union, only a select few officials knew what had happened. The contaminated zone didn't appear on maps. The villages within it simply vanished from official records. Over the following days and weeks, about 10,000 people were evacuated from the most contaminated areas. They were given 2 hours to pack, told they were being temporarily relocated and taken to new settlements. They weren't told why. They weren't warned about radiation exposure. The evacuation was conducted with military efficiency and total information control. The 23 small villages in the contaminated zone were literally erased. Buildings were demolished or buried. Trees were cut down and buried. Topsoil was removed from areas near the villages. Any evidence that people had lived there was eliminated. When you drove through the area afterward, there was simply empty land where communities had stood for generations. For those who remained in the less contaminated areas or who were exposed during the evacuation, the health effects began to appear. Cancer rates increased dramatically. Genetic damage appeared in subsequent generations. But because the disaster was secret, those suffering couldn't understand why they were sick. Doctors couldn't tell patients the truth about their exposure even when they knew it. The secrecy surrounding Kyshtym was so complete that when a Soviet scientist named Georges Medvedev, who had emigrated to Britain, published an article about the disaster in 1976, Western scientists were skeptical. Some thought he was describing a different incident or exaggerating. The CIA had detected unusual activity in the area in 1957, but didn't understand what had happened. It wasn't until Glasnost in the late 1980s that the Soviet government officially acknowledged the disaster, over 30 years after it occurred. What we know now is that Kyshtym was actually one of multiple disasters at Mayak. The Teka River contamination affected about 124,000 people. The 1957 explosion exposed about 270,000 more. And there were other incidents, fires, leaks, and releases that were never fully documented. The entire region around Mayak became one of the most contaminated places on Earth. The Lake Karachay facility at Mayak, where some liquid waste was stored, became so radioactive that standing on its shore for an hour would deliver a fatal dose of radiation. In 1967, a drought dried up part of the lake, and wind carried radioactive dust over an even larger area, exposing another 500,000 people to contamination. The lake was eventually filled in with concrete to prevent further incidents. Today, the area around Mayak remains heavily contaminated. The Teka River system still carries radioactive isotopes downstream. Villages that weren't evacuated in 1957 have experienced elevated cancer rates for generations. The long-term health study of Mayak workers and nearby residents has become one of the most important sources of data on chronic radiation exposure. Knowledge purchased at a terrible human cost. What makes the Kyshtym disaster particularly tragic is its preventability. The explosion resulted from a cooling system failure that could have been avoided with proper maintenance and monitoring. The scale of the disaster reflected the enormous quantities of waste being generated by a program that prioritized speed over safety. And the human cost was magnified by the secrecy that prevented proper medical care and continued to expose people unnecessarily. The lessons of Kyshtym should have transformed nuclear safety culture, but because the disaster was secret, those lessons weren't learned globally. Other countries continued operating facilities with similar risks, unaware of what had happened in the Ural Mountains. The Soviet culture of secrecy, of prioritizing political goals over human safety, of sacrificing the few for the supposed good of the many, would contribute to an even greater disaster 3 decades later at a place called Chernobyl. But before Chernobyl, another nuclear power would face its own reckoning with atomic energy. Just weeks after the Kyshtym explosion, on the other side of Europe, Britain would experience a nuclear fire that came terrifyingly close to becoming a catastrophe on a similar scale. The Lake District of northwest England is known for its stunning natural beauty. Rolling hills, pristine lakes, picturesque villages that look like they've stepped out of a storybook. It seems like the last place you'd build a nuclear reactor. But in the late 1940s, Britain was desperate to join the nuclear club, and the remote location near the village of Windscale, close to the Irish Sea, was chosen as the site for the Windscale facility, Britain's answer to America's Manhattan Project. The Windscale piles, as the reactors were called, were built with remarkable speed. Construction began in 1947, and the first pile went critical in October 1950. These weren't power reactors designed to generate electricity. They were production reactors built for one purpose, creating plutonium for nuclear weapons. Britain had been excluded from American nuclear secrets after the war despite having contributed significantly to the Manhattan Project, and Prime Minister Clement Attlee was determined that Britain would build its own atomic arsenal. The reactor design reflected this urgency. The Windscale piles were graphite-moderated, air-cooled reactors, relatively simple in concept, but with design limitations that would prove catastrophic. Natural uranium fuel was loaded into channels running through blocks of graphite, which moderated the nuclear reaction. Air was blown through the reactor to cool it, then expelled through enormous chimneys that became local landmarks, visible for miles across the countryside. At the last minute, a scientist named John Cockcroft insisted that filters be installed at the top of the chimneys. His colleagues thought this was overcautious and unnecessary. The filters would reduce airflow and cost money. But Cockcroft insisted, and reluctantly, filters were added. They became known as Cockcroft's Folly, a nickname that would later transform into Cockcroft's Savior when they prevented an even worse disaster. The reactors operated successfully for several years, producing plutonium for Britain's nuclear weapons program. But there was a problem the designers hadn't fully anticipated: Wigner energy. When graphite is exposed to neutron radiation, some of the energy is stored in the crystal structure rather than being released as heat. Over time, this stored energy accumulates, and if the graphite temperature rises sufficiently, this energy can release suddenly, heating the graphite even further in a self-sustaining reaction. The solution was periodic annealing operations where the reactor would be shut down and carefully heated to release the stored Wigner energy in a controlled way. This was a delicate operation requiring precise temperature control. Heat the graphite too little, and the Wigner energy doesn't fully release. Heat it too much, and you risk damaging the fuel or starting a fire. The procedure had been performed successfully multiple times on both Windscale piles. On October 7, 1957, operators began a routine Wigner energy release on Pile 1. But the operation didn't go as planned. The temperature rise was uneven across the reactor, with some areas not reaching the temperature needed to release their stored energy. The following day, concerned that the annealing hadn't been successful, the operators decided to try again, heating the reactor for a second time. This was a mistake. In trying to ensure complete annealing, they created conditions for disaster. Some areas of the reactor, which had successfully released their Wigner energy the first time, were now being heated again while still containing hot fuel. Other areas, which hadn't reached annealing temperature initially, were finally heating up, but now surrounded by even hotter material. On the afternoon of October 10, the reactor's temperature began rising uncontrollably. Operators realized something was wrong and shut down the nuclear reaction, but the temperature continued climbing. Stored Wigner energy was releasing throughout the graphite core, and the heat was building toward the ignition point of graphite, around 640 degrees Celsius. Tom Chewy, the deputy general manager, climbed to the top of the reactor, up the long ladder inside the massive chimney structure, and used an inspection window to look directly into the channels. What he saw was terrifying. The fuel cartridges were glowing red-hot, and some were clearly burning. The reactor, all 1,500 tons of graphite and uranium, was on fire. The immediate instinct was to increase airflow to cool the reactor. But increasing air to a graphite fire is like using a bellows on a campfire. It makes it worse. The more air they pushed through, the hotter the fire burned. Radioactive smoke was now pouring from the chimney, and the filters that had been installed as Cockcroft's folly were catching some, but not all, of the radioactive particles. The surrounding countryside was being contaminated with every minute that passed. The operators faced an agonizing decision. Water and fire don't mix well under normal circumstances. Water and nuclear reactors mix even worse. If they flooded the reactor with water, the sudden cooling could crack the graphite, creating a massive release of radioactive material. The water could react with the hot uranium to produce hydrogen, which could explode. And there was another fear. If water reached the lower, hotter parts of the reactor while the upper parts were still on fire, the steam could blow radioactive material out of the top of the reactor in a massive cloud. For hours, they tried everything else. They attempted to remove burning fuel cartridges using long poles, but the channels were blocked by damaged, melted fuel. They tried carbon dioxide, but it had little effect on a fire this intense. The temperature kept climbing. The fire was spreading through the reactor core. Radioactive contamination was increasing in the surrounding area. The moment for desperate measures had arrived. Tom Chewy made the decision. They would flood the reactor with water and accept whatever consequences followed. Firefighters connected hoses to the reactor's cooling system. At 8:55 a.m. on October 11, water began flowing into the burning reactor core. What happened next could have been catastrophic. The water hitting the 1,300-degree graphite created enormous amounts of steam. There were sharp cracking sounds as thermal stress fractured materials inside the reactor. For several minutes, the radiation levels spiked as contaminated steam poured from the chimney. But the explosion everyone feared didn't happen. Slowly, gradually, the temperature began to drop. They kept the water flowing for 30 hours, monitoring the reactor's temperature, listening for any sounds that might indicate structural failure, and watching radiation monitors anxiously. Finally, on October 12, they were confident the fire was out. The reactor was a write-off, destroyed beyond any hope of repair. But the facility itself was intact, and the catastrophic release they'd feared had been averted. But the question remained, how much radiation had escaped? The filters had caught perhaps 90% of the radioactive particles, but that still meant a significant release. The initial official response was to downplay the danger. The public was told there had been an incident at Windscale, but nothing to worry about. Local residents knew something serious had happened. They'd seen the unusual activity, the fire brigades, the official cars, and some reported that the smell from the chimneys had changed, becoming acrid and chemical. Over the following days, as radiation monitoring revealed the extent of contamination, officials realized they had a serious problem. Radioactive iodine-131 had been deposited across surrounding farmland. This isotope concentrates in milk, and dairy farming was a major industry in the area. On October 12, the government ordered that milk from about 500 square kilometers around Windscale be destroyed rather than consumed. For local dairy farmers, this was a disaster within a disaster. Their livelihoods depended on milk production, and now tankers were arriving daily to collect milk that would be dumped rather than sold. Some farmers watched as thousands of gallons of milk were poured into the Irish Sea or buried in trenches. The government provided some compensation, but the economic impact on farming communities was severe, and the psychological impact of seeing their product treated as contaminated waste was crushing. The estimated radiation release from Windscale was about 740 terabecquerels of iodine-131, along with other radioactive isotopes. Studies conducted decades later estimated that this release may have caused around 240 additional cancer cases, though the exact number is impossible to determine with certainty. The contamination was detected as far away as Germany and Norway, though at lower levels. The British government's response to Windscale was characterized by secrecy and minimization. The full report on the accident was classified, with only a sanitized version released to the public. The true causes, the design flaws in the reactor, the inadequate instrumentation, the pressure to produce plutonium on accelerated schedules, were obscured. Officials emphasized that there were no immediate deaths, that contamination was limited, and that everything was under control. This approach was partly practical. Britain was in the midst of developing its nuclear deterrent and didn't want to alarm the public or provide information to Soviet intelligence. But it was also a pattern that would appear in nuclear accidents again and again. The tendency to minimize, to reassure, to withhold information in the name of preventing panic, even when that meant people couldn't make informed decisions about their own safety. Tom Chewy, who made the decision to flood the reactor with water and very possibly prevented a much worse disaster, received a small bonus and a letter of commendation. He continued working in the nuclear industry until his retirement. Years later, he developed cancer, which he believed was related to his radiation exposure at Windscale. He died in 2008, long after the reactor he'd fought to save had been entombed in concrete. The Windscale fire did lead to improvements in reactor design and safety culture. The accident demonstrated the importance of better instrumentation, improved training, and careful thought about worst-case scenarios. The filters that Cockcroft had insisted on became standard equipment for similar facilities. The disaster contributed to the development of modern nuclear safety culture, the idea that safety must be embedded in design, operations, and organizational culture. The night shift at 3 Mile Island Nuclear Power Plant near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania began normally enough on March 28, 1979. Unit 2, one of 2 reactors at the facility, had been operating at 97% power, generating electricity for homes and businesses across the region. The plant sat on an island in the Susquehanna River, its massive cooling towers visible for miles around. A symbol of America's commitment to nuclear energy as a solution to the oil crisis of the 1970s. At 4:00 a.m., something went wrong in the secondary cooling system, the non-radioactive water loop that removes heat from the reactor. A valve failed, blocking the flow of water to the steam generators. This wasn't supposed to be a serious problem. The reactor had multiple backup systems, and the operators were trained to handle this exact scenario. The reactor scrambled automatically, meaning the control rods inserted to stop the nuclear reaction. Everything should have been fine. But then the problems began cascading in ways no one had anticipated. With the secondary cooling stopped, pressure in the primary cooling system, the radioactive water that actually touches the reactor core, began rising. This too was expected, and another automatic system responded. A pressure relief valve opened to release some of that pressure. Again, this was all according to plan. The problem was that after the pressure dropped to safe levels, the relief valve didn't close. It stuck open, and a light in the control room incorrectly indicated that it had closed properly. Through this open valve, radioactive cooling water began pouring out of the primary system into a containment tank at a rate of about 220 gallons per minute. The operators, watching their instruments, saw the pressurizer level rising and interpreted this as meaning they had too much water in the system. In reality, the loss of coolant through the stuck valve was causing the water to boil and expand, creating steam bubbles that made the water level appear higher than it actually was. Following their training and the indications they were seeing, the operators reduced the emergency cooling water flow. They were trying to solve a problem they thought they had, too much water, while the actual problem was the opposite. They were losing coolant rapidly. For the next several hours, the operators struggled to understand what was happening. The control room contained more than 600 alarms, and many of them were now sounding. Lights flashed across the control panels. The printer that recorded events was running so fast that it fell hours behind, making it impossible to track the sequence of events. The noise was overwhelming, and the information contradictory. Meanwhile, inside the reactor vessel, the water level was dropping. Parts of the reactor core began to become uncovered, exposed to steam rather than liquid water. Without water covering them, the fuel rods began to heat up dramatically. The zirconium cladding on the fuel rods started reacting with the steam, producing hydrogen gas. Temperatures in the exposed part of the core exceeded 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The fuel began to melt. At 6:00 a.m., 2 hours into the accident, a new shift arrived. The incoming shift supervisor looked at the chaotic control room and the confused operators and began asking different questions. Gradually, the picture became clearer. They had a loss of coolant accident. The relief valve was stuck open. The core was uncovered and damaged. They had a partial meltdown in progress. The operators finally closed a backup valve that isolated the stuck relief valve, stopping the leak. They increased emergency cooling flow. Slowly, they began to stabilize the reactor, but enormous damage had already been done. About half of the reactor core had melted. Radioactive gases had escaped into the containment building. Some had vented to the atmosphere. The reactor that had been generating electricity 12 hours earlier was now a pile of damaged fuel, twisted metal, and radioactive debris. And then the situation got worse in a different way. The public found out. News began to spread that something had happened at 3 Mile Island. Initial statements from the utility company and officials were reassuring. A minor problem, everything under control, no danger to the public. But reporters noticed the evacuation of non-essential personnel from the plant. They saw emergency vehicles and official cars converging on the site, and they started asking harder questions. By Friday, March 30, confusion and fear were spreading across central Pennsylvania. Different officials were giving different information. The governor's office was hearing one thing from the utility company and something else from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Radiation measurements were being reported, but without context, the numbers meant little to the public. Were they in danger? Should they evacuate? Nobody seemed able to give a clear answer. The situation became surreal when people realized that a movie called The China Syndrome, about a nuclear accident and cover-up, had been released just 12 days before the 3 Mile Island accident. The The film starred Jane Fonda as a reporter investigating safety problems at a nuclear plant and featured a scenario eerily similar to what was unfolding in Pennsylvania. Suddenly, the movie's premise didn't seem so far-fetched. Art and reality had collided in the most unsettling way. On Friday afternoon, Governor Richard Thornburgh advised pregnant women and preschool children within 5 miles of the plant to evacuate. This triggered a much larger voluntary evacuation as families decided to leave the area. Over the next few days, an estimated 144,000 people left the region, clogging highways, filling hotels in surrounding areas, and creating a refugee crisis in the middle of Pennsylvania. Inside the plant, operators were dealing with a new crisis, the hydrogen bubble. The chemical reaction between steam and zirconium had produced a large bubble of hydrogen gas inside the reactor vessel. If this bubble exploded, it could breach the containment and release massive amounts of radiation. Engineers debated whether the hydrogen concentration could reach explosive levels. Some calculations suggested it could. The image of an explosion at 3 Mile Island terrified everyone involved. For several days, the hydrogen bubble dominated planning and public concern. Experts disagreed on the level of danger. Some thought the bubble could be vented safely. Others feared that venting would release too much radiation. Still others argued that the bubble would gradually dissolve on its own if left alone. The debate played out partly in public, adding to the confusion and fear. Fortunately, the explosion never happened. The hydrogen gradually dissolved into the cooling water, and by April 1, the immediate crisis had passed. The reactor was stable, though damaged beyond repair. The evacuation advisory was lifted. Families began returning to their homes, but nothing would be the same. The actual radiation release from 3 Mile Island was relatively small. About 15 curies of iodine-131 reached the environment, compared to the 740 terabecquerels, about 20,000 curies at Windscale, or the massive releases at Chernobyl years later. Studies conducted over subsequent decades found no clear evidence of increased cancer rates in the surrounding population. By the standards of nuclear accidents, 3 Mile Island's health impact was minimal. But the psychological and political impact was enormous. The accident demonstrated that a modern nuclear plant, designed with multiple safety systems, operated by trained personnel, could still suffer a severe accident. The partial meltdown showed that the worst-case scenario nuclear engineers had designed against could actually happen. And the confused, contradictory public communications destroyed trust between the nuclear industry and the American public. The accident revealed critical flaws in nuclear plant design and operation. The control room at 3 Mile Island was poorly designed for emergency conditions. The operators had been trained to respond to single failures, not to cascading problems with conflicting indications. The relief valve that stuck open was a known problem that hadn't been adequately addressed. Communication between the plant operators, the utility company, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and state officials was chaotic and ineffective. In the aftermath, the nuclear industry and regulators made substantial changes. Control room design improved dramatically, with better organization of instruments and clearer indication of system status. Operator training was overhauled to include realistic simulator practice and greater emphasis on understanding overall plant status, rather than just following procedures. Emergency planning became much more detailed and coordinated. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission expanded and strengthened its oversight. But the damage to nuclear power's reputation was lasting. Before 3 Mile Island, utilities had orders for dozens of new nuclear plants. After 3 Mile Island, no new nuclear plants were ordered in the United States for 3 decades. Plants under construction faced costly delays as new safety requirements were implemented. Some were canceled entirely. The nuclear renaissance that had been predicted for the 1980s simply didn't happen. The cleanup of 3 Mile Island Unit 2 took nearly 14 years and cost about $1 billion. Workers had to enter highly radioactive areas to remove damaged fuel and decontaminate systems. Some of the fuel had melted into bizarre formations that had never been seen before. The reactor vessel itself contained a solidified mass of once molten fuel that took years to remove carefully. The entire process was a kind of archaeological excavation of a disaster, teaching engineers about what actually happens during a meltdown. 3 Mile Island's Unit 1, which had been shut down for refueling when the accident occurred, eventually restarted and operated until 2019, when it was closed for economic reasons. Unit 2's reactor building still stands, now permanently sealed, a tomb for equipment that will remain radioactive for decades. Tour of the facility show visitors the control room of Unit 2, preserved as it was during the accident, a museum of a moment when complex technology overwhelmed human operators and America's confidence in nuclear power shattered. For the people who lived through those days in March and April 1979, the accident left lasting marks. Some never fully trusted official statements about radiation levels. Families who evacuated remembered the fear and confusion, the difficulty in getting clear information, the feeling of being trapped between contradictory advice. Property values in the area dropped and took years to recover. The psychological stress of living near a damaged nuclear plant, even after the immediate danger passed, affected community mental health. 3 Mile Island demonstrated something that nuclear advocates had been reluctant to admit. Nuclear accidents could happen in America at modern facilities, despite all the safeguards and training. The accident wasn't caused by communist inefficiency or wartime urgency or primitive technology. It resulted from a combination of equipment failure, inadequate design, and human error, factors that could exist anywhere, at any nuclear facility. The lesson should have been universal and permanent. Nuclear technology demands extraordinary care, redundant safety systems, excellent operator training, and honest communication with the public. Some of these lessons were learned. But 7 years later, on the other side of the world, a disaster would occur that would make 3 Mile Island look like a minor incident. And many of the same factors, pressure to meet targets, inadequate safety culture, poor communication, and human error, would combine to create the worst nuclear accident in history. The city of Pripyat was built for the future. Established in 1970 to house workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, it was a model Soviet city. Wide boulevards, modern apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, a cultural center, an amusement park ready to open for May Day celebrations. Nearly 50,000 people lived there, most of them young families. The average age of residents was 26. It was a place of optimism, where children played in courtyards and parents enjoyed guaranteed jobs and the privileges that came with working in the Soviet Union's prestigious nuclear industry. 9 miles away, the V.I. Lenin nuclear power station, known worldwide simply as Chernobyl, stood on the banks of the Pripyat River. 4 RBMK-1000 reactors were operational, and 2 more were under construction. The RBMK design was uniquely Soviet. Huge reactors using graphite moderation and water cooling, designed to produce both electricity and plutonium for weapons. They were powerful, relatively cheap to build, and had a crucial flaw that few understood. Under certain conditions, they became unstable in ways that could lead to runaway reactions. On the night of April 25, 1986, the crew at Reactor 4 was preparing to conduct a test. The test itself had a safety purpose. It was designed to determine whether the reactor's turbines could provide enough electrical power during the brief gap between a power loss and the startup of emergency diesel generators. It was a reasonable question to ask, and the test had been planned for months. But a series of decisions, delays, and miscommunications turned a safety test into the trigger for catastrophe. The test had been scheduled for the day shift, with experienced operators, but delays in the power grid meant the test had to be postponed to the night shift. The night shift crew was less experienced, and crucially, the reactor's chief engineer wasn't present. To conduct the test, the reactor's power needed to be reduced. The operators began lowering power around 1:00 a.m. on April 26. The plan was to stabilize at about 25% power, but due to operator error and a quirk in the automated control system, power dropped much further, to about 1% of normal operation. At this very low power level, the reactor developed what's called xenon poisoning, the buildup of neutron-absorbing isotopes that make it difficult to increase power again. The operators should have shut down the reactor and waited for the xenon to decay, a process taking hours. But the test was scheduled, supervisors were waiting for results, and there was pressure to complete it. The operators decided to push forward, manually withdrawing control rods to compensate for the xenon poisoning and increase power. They managed to raise power to about 7% of normal, far below the planned 25%, and well into a range where the reactor design had dangerous instabilities. The RBMK reactor had a characteristic called a positive void coefficient. In simple terms, this meant that if water in the reactor turned to steam, creating voids, the nuclear reaction increased rather than decreased. Most Western reactors have negative void coefficients. Steam formation reduces the reaction, making them inherently stable. But the RBMK design, under certain conditions, could create a feedback loop. More heat creates more steam, which increases the reaction, which creates more heat. At low power, with many control rods withdrawn, Reactor 4 was like a spring compressed almost to its limit. And the operators, focused on completing their test, didn't fully understand just how unstable their reactor had become. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, they began the test. They shut off the emergency cooling systems. They would interfere with the test results. They reduced water flow to the reactor. These actions, individually and especially together, removed safety margins. The reactor was now in a forbidden configuration, operating in ranges specifically prohibited by the operating manual. Within seconds, everything went wrong. Power began increasing. Water in the cooling channels began boiling more vigorously. The increased steam, because of the positive void coefficient, accelerated the nuclear reaction. Power surged upward. In a desperately late response, the operators hit the emergency shutdown button, which should have inserted all control rods and stopped the reaction. But the RBMK design had another fatal flaw. The control rods had graphite tips, and when they first entered the reactor, these tips actually briefly increased the reaction before the neutron-absorbing section could take effect. In a stable reactor, this quirk didn't matter. In Reactor 4's unstable state, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Power spiked to perhaps 100 times the reactor's maximum rated output. The fuel exploded. Not a nuclear explosion like a bomb, but a massive steam explosion as cooling water turned instantly to high-pressure steam. The 1,000-ton reactor lid was blown off. A second explosion followed seconds later, possibly from hydrogen or carbon monoxide combustion. The explosions blew apart the reactor core, tore open the building, and sent burning chunks of graphite and fuel flying into the air. The graphite moderator, exposed to air and heated to extreme temperatures, began to burn. This wasn't a brief fire. Graphite fires are intensely hot and difficult to extinguish. The reactor, now open to the atmosphere, was like a giant radioactive bonfire, pouring smoke and particles into the night sky. The first people to witness the disaster were the plant operators. From the control room, they felt the explosions but couldn't initially see what had happened. Some operators, disbelieving that the reactor could be destroyed, went to look. What they saw was incomprehensible. The massive reactor hull was simply gone, replaced by glowing wreckage and flame. The radiation levels were so high that their dosimeters immediately maxed out. In the crucial first minutes, the operators faced impossible choices. The reactor was destroyed, but other systems needed attention to prevent further damage. Some workers stayed at their posts, trying to shut down systems and prevent additional explosions, even as they absorbed lethal doses of radiation. Their actions probably prevented the other 3 reactors from being damaged, which would have made the disaster exponentially worse. The firefighters who responded had no idea what they were facing. They were told there was a fire at the power plant, not that a nuclear reactor had exploded. They arrived in ordinary firefighting gear, not radiation suits. Chief of the Fire Brigade Victor Kyshtym led his men onto the roof of the turbine hall, where burning chunks of graphite had started fires. The men picked up pieces of this graphite with their bare hands to throw them off the roof, not understanding that they were handling intensely radioactive reactor core material. The firefighters performed heroically, extinguishing the fires on the roof and preventing the disaster from spreading to Reactor 3. But the cost was terrible. Many received doses of radiation that were immediately fatal. They developed symptoms within hours: nausea, vomiting, skin reddening. Within days, those most exposed began dying from acute radiation syndrome, their bodies breaking down as radiation destroyed their bone marrow and internal organs. In Pripyat, less than 2 miles away, people saw the glow in the sky and heard the explosions, but most went back to sleep. In the morning, people went about their normal routines. Children went to school, workers to their jobs. Some went to the railway bridge to watch the beautiful blue light above the reactor, not knowing they were staring at ionized air and receiving dangerous doses of radiation. The bridge later became known grimly as the Bridge of Death, though the exact fate of those who stood there remains disputed. The Soviet authorities faced a decision: admit the scale of the disaster and evacuate immediately, or maintain the appearance of control and avoid panic. They chose delay. For more than 24 hours after the explosion, Pripyat residents were not told to take precautions, to stay indoors, or to prepare for evacuation. Children played outside in radioactive dust. People went shopping, attended school, continued normal life while radiation levels climbed. Finally, at 2:00 p.m. on April 27, more than 36 hours after the explosion, the evacuation order came. Residents were told to prepare for a temporary evacuation, to take only documents and essential items, that they would return in a few days. Buses arrived, over 1,200 of them, and in 3 hours the entire city was emptied. The residents of Pripyat left behind their homes, their belongings, their pets, their lives. They never returned. The temporary evacuation became permanent. But the disaster was far from over. The destroyed reactor continued burning. Radiation poured into the atmosphere, and the Soviet leadership realized they faced a crisis that could spread across Europe and beyond. The radiation cloud was already drifting over Belarus, Poland, Scandinavia, and Western Europe. Rain brought radioactive particles down across vast areas. Sheep in Wales and reindeer in Scandinavia would show contamination for years to come. The response required unprecedented action. Helicopters began dropping sand, boron, lead, and clay onto the burning reactor, trying to smother the fire. The pilots flew through radiation so intense that one crew member recalled seeing a glow like moonlight inside the helicopter from the radiation. In the first days, helicopter crews had no radiation protection and little understanding of what they were being exposed to. Many suffered severe radiation sickness and died within months. By early May, the graphite fire was finally extinguished, but the destroyed reactor remained intensely radioactive and dangerously unstable. Engineers feared that the melted fuel might burn through the reactor's foundation and reach the water-filled bubbler pools beneath, potentially causing a massive steam explosion that could destroy the other reactors. Teams of men, nicknamed suicide squads, though they preferred liquidators, volunteered to dive into the flooded basement to drain the water. The divers succeeded, working in darkness in highly contaminated water to open drainage valves. Their radiation exposure was severe, though contrary to some dramatic accounts, not all died immediately. The disaster created many such heroes, men who knowingly accepted radiation exposure to prevent worse outcomes. The next challenge was the pile of radioactive fuel and debris inside the destroyed reactor. Soviet authorities decided to entomb the reactor in concrete, a structure that became known as the sarcophagus. Building it required workers to operate in extreme radiation. Shifts were measured in seconds in the most contaminated areas. Men would run in, perform a specific task, and run out again, their lifetime radiation exposure used up in moments. Some tasks required minutes, which meant workers accepted doses that would cause radiation sickness. Understanding this was necessary to prevent catastrophe for millions of others. Over 600,000 people served as liquidators in the months and years following the disaster. They came from across the Soviet Union. Soldiers, reservists, miners, engineers, firefighters. They cleaned radioactive debris from roofs, buried contaminated buildings and soil, constructed the sarcophagus, and performed countless tasks in dangerous conditions. Many received doses that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. The Soviet government awarded them medals and privileges, but these couldn't compensate for the cancers, the children born with defects, the shortened lifespans. The human cost of Chernobyl remains debated. The immediate deaths, operators and firefighters who died of acute radiation syndrome in the weeks following the accident, number around 30. But the long-term health effects are far harder to calculate. Thyroid cancer rates in affected areas, especially in children, increased dramatically. The World Health Organization estimates that up to 4,000 additional cancer deaths may eventually result from the radiation exposure, though other estimates run much higher. Psychological effects, stress, anxiety, displacement trauma, affected hundreds of thousands. The environmental contamination was staggering. An area of over 1,000 square miles around the plant was designated the exclusion zone and remains largely uninhabited. The forests around Chernobyl turned reddish-brown and died, creating the Red Forest, which remains one of the most contaminated areas on Earth. Rivers and groundwater carried radioactive materials downstream, affecting water supplies and ecosystems far from the plant. Yet nature has proven resilient in unexpected ways. Without human presence, wildlife has returned to the exclusion zone. Wolves, bears, lynx, and even endangered European bison now roam freely. The abandoned city of Pripyat, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation, has become a haunting monument to the disaster. Rusting bumper cars in the amusement park that never opened, classrooms with books still on desks, homes with personal belongings left behind in the rushed evacuation. The causes of the Chernobyl disaster were multiple and interconnected. The RBMK reactor design had inherent flaws that made it dangerously unstable under certain conditions. The operators made serious errors, driven partly by inadequate training and partly by a culture that prioritized meeting targets and following orders over questioning safety. The Soviet system's obsession with secrecy meant that information about previous RBMK incidents wasn't shared. So operators at Chernobyl didn't know about risks that had been discovered at other plants. Most fundamentally, Chernobyl revealed the danger of what's called normalization of deviance, the gradual process by which unacceptable practices become acceptable through repetition. The operators had violated procedures before without disaster, so the violations seemed less risky. The reactor had been operated in forbidden configurations previously, so doing it again didn't seem catastrophic, until it was. The political consequences of Chernobyl extended far beyond nuclear safety. The disaster's scale couldn't be hidden, and the Soviet government's initial denials and minimizations destroyed what remained of public trust. Some historians argue that Chernobyl contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, demonstrating the system's fundamental dishonesty and incompetence. When the truth can't be hidden and the official story is obviously false, people stop believing anything the government says. For the global nuclear industry, Chernobyl was both a tragedy and a catalyst for change. The accident demonstrated that nuclear disasters could have transnational consequences. Radiation doesn't respect borders. International cooperation on nuclear safety increased dramatically. Design flaws in RBMK reactors and similar designs were addressed. Safety culture became a central focus, with recognition that technical safeguards alone were insufficient without an organizational culture that prioritized safety absolutely. March 11, 2011 began as an ordinary Friday in northeastern Japan. At the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, 6 reactors sat along the Pacific coast. 3 were operating, 1 was shut down for maintenance with fuel removed, and 2 were also shut down for inspection. The facility had operated for decades without serious incident, a symbol of Japan's advanced nuclear program and its reliance on nuclear energy to power an industrial economy with minimal domestic fossil fuel resources. At 2:46 p.m., the ground began to shake. The Tohoku earthquake, magnitude 9, had struck offshore, one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded. The shaking lasted 6 minutes, a terrifyingly long duration that damaged buildings across northeastern Japan. But the Fukushima Daiichi reactors responded exactly as designed. The 3 operating reactors, Units 1, 2, and 3, automatically scrammed, inserting control rods to stop the nuclear reactions. Backup diesel generators started immediately to provide power for cooling systems. Everything was working as it should. The operators, though shaken by the earthquake, began following their procedures for a reactor shutdown following seismic events. They were experienced, well-trained, and had practiced these procedures many times. The reactors were stable. The crisis appeared to be manageable. What they didn't know was that the real danger was still approaching, building in the ocean 45 miles offshore. The earthquake had displaced a section of the Pacific seafloor, lifting it by several meters and displacing enormous quantities of water. This water was now rushing toward the Japanese coast as a tsunami, traveling at hundreds of miles per hour across the open ocean. As it approached the shallower coastal waters, it slowed but grew in height, the wave's energy concentrating as the ocean depth decreased. At approximately 3:27 p.m., about 40 minutes after the earthquake, the tsunami struck Fukushima Daiichi. The plant had been built to withstand tsunamis up to 5.7 meters high, based on historical data and geographical studies. The wave that hit was over 14 meters high, more than twice the design basis. It overwhelmed the seawalls, flooded the low-lying areas where critical backup generators and electrical equipment were housed, and in minutes destroyed systems that the reactors depended upon for cooling. Water rushed into the basements where the diesel generators were located. The generators, which had been running perfectly since the earthquake, drowned and failed. Seawater flooded electrical switchgear and batteries. The plant lost all AC power, what nuclear engineers call station blackout, one of the worst scenarios in nuclear safety planning. The reactors still had battery-powered cooling for a while, but batteries wouldn't last long. Without power to run pumps, the reactors couldn't be cooled, and without cooling, the decay heat from the nuclear fuel. Even with the reactions stopped, radioactive decay continues generating heat, would eventually boil away the water and damage the fuel. The operators faced a nightmare scenario. All three operating reactors were in trouble simultaneously. Communication with the outside world was difficult. The tsunami had destroyed infrastructure across the region, phone lines were down, roads were impassable. The operators couldn't simply leave. Radioactive releases were possible, and without cooling, the reactors could melt down. They were on their own, with failing systems, incomplete information, and a disaster unfolding in real time. In the hours that followed, the operators struggled desperately to maintain cooling. They tried connecting portable generators, but the flooded electrical systems wouldn't accept power. They attempted to manually operate valves to relieve pressure, but many valves required electrical power or compressed air that wasn't available. Some workers ventured into dangerously radioactive areas to manually open valves, accepting significant radiation exposure to perform tasks that should have been remotely controlled. By late evening on March 11, operators knew they were losing the battle at Unit 1. The water level in the reactor was dropping. The fuel was becoming uncovered. Temperatures were rising toward the point where fuel damage would occur. Shortly after 9:00 p.m., officials made the decision to begin evacuating people from the area around the plant. First, a 3-kilometer radius, then 10 kilometers, and eventually 20 kilometers as the situation deteriorated. Early on March 12, the inevitable happened. The fuel in Unit 1 became uncovered and began to melt. The zirconium cladding reacted with steam, producing hydrogen gas. Pressure built up in the containment. Operators vented the containment to prevent it from rupturing, releasing radioactive gases, but maintaining the primary barrier between the melted fuel and the environment. The hydrogen, however, didn't stay in the containment. It leaked into the reactor building. At 3:36 p.m. on March 12, a massive explosion destroyed the upper part of Unit 1's reactor building. The hydrogen had found an ignition source, and the resulting explosion blew off the building's roof and upper walls. Miraculously, the explosion didn't breach the containment structure, and no one was killed by the blast. But the sight of the explosion, broadcast on television worldwide, signaled that Fukushima had become a major nuclear disaster. Units 2 and 3 were following similar trajectories, their fuel uncovering, melting, producing hydrogen. On March 14, Unit 3's reactor building exploded in an even more dramatic blast. On March 15, an explosion damaged Unit 2's suppression chamber, and a fire broke out at Unit 4, which had been shut down but whose spent fuel pool contained considerable fuel. For several days, the situation seemed almost apocalyptic. With multiple reactors damaged, radiation levels rising, and limited ability to control or even fully understand what was happening. The workers who remained at the plant, sometimes called the Fukushima 50, though their numbers varied, worked in extraordinarily difficult conditions. Radiation levels in some areas were high enough to limit work to minutes. The plant's emergency operations center was damaged. Food and water were limited. Communication remained difficult. Yet these workers stayed, attempting whatever actions might prevent the disaster from worsening, knowing they were accumulating radiation doses that would affect their health. One critical concern was the spent fuel pools, large pools of water that stored used fuel from previous reactor operations. These pools were located high in the reactor buildings, outside the containment structures. If the water boiled away, the spent fuel could catch fire, releasing enormous quantities of radiation. At Unit 4, the spent fuel pool's status was unknown for days, with officials fearing the worst. When helicopter surveys finally confirmed water remained in the pool, it was a significant relief, though the mystery of why the pool hadn't boiled dry, likely water sloshing in from the adjacent unit's pool during the earthquake, wasn't solved until later. The response involved desperate improvisation. Fire trucks pumped seawater into the reactors, salt water that would corrode the systems but was the only available coolant in sufficient quantities. Military helicopters dropped water on the spent fuel pools. Concrete pumper trucks, borrowed from construction companies, and even Yakuza, Japanese organized crime groups who owned them, were used to spray water from safer distances. Every action was a compromise between radiation exposure to workers and the need to control the disaster. The radiation releases from Fukushima contaminated a large area northwest of the plant, where wind patterns carried radioactive particles inland. Approximately 160,000 people were evacuated, most from areas where radiation levels exceeded long-term safety limits. Restrictions on food and water from contaminated areas affected agriculture and fishing across the region. The psychological trauma of displacement, uncertainty about radiation exposure, and fear for children's health created lasting impacts on affected communities. Unlike Chernobyl, there were no immediate deaths from radiation at Fukushima. The evacuation itself, however, was traumatic and deadly. Approximately 2,300 deaths are attributed to the stress and conditions of evacuation, particularly among elderly and ill patients moved from hospitals and care facilities. The long-term cancer risk from radiation exposure is estimated to be small but non-zero, with most exposure coming from the evacuation zones, temporary residents, and workers at the plant. The environmental contamination was substantial, but more limited than Chernobyl. The majority of radioactive material was carried out to sea rather than depositing on land. Nevertheless, areas around the plant remained too contaminated for unrestricted habitation. Decontamination efforts have involved removing topsoil, washing buildings, and stripping vegetation from vast areas. Bags of contaminated soil, millions of them, sit in temporary storage sites awaiting final disposal that may not occur for decades. The damaged reactors themselves present an almost incomprehensible cleanup challenge. The melted fuel, called corium, solidified in shapes and locations that weren't fully mapped for years. Robots sent to investigate have failed in the extreme radiation and difficult conditions. The current plan is to remove the fuel debris, but this process won't be completed until perhaps the 2040s or 2050s. The estimated cost of the Fukushima cleanup exceeds $200 billion, making it one of the most expensive industrial disasters in history. Fukushima raised profound questions about nuclear safety in the face of natural disasters. The plant had been built to withstand significant earthquakes and tsunamis, yet it failed when faced with events that, while rare, were within the range of historical possibility for Japan. The regulatory assumption that certain combinations of events were too unlikely to plan for proved tragically wrong. The disaster demonstrated that defense in depth, multiple layers of safety systems, could be defeated if a single event, the tsunami, could disable multiple systems simultaneously. The disaster also revealed organizational and cultural factors that contributed to inadequate preparation. Japanese nuclear regulators had been warned about tsunami risks at coastal nuclear plants, but hadn't required upgrades. The concept of regulatory capture, where regulators become too close to the industry they regulate, meant that safety concerns were sometimes subordinated to economic considerations. After Fukushima, Japan's nuclear regulatory system was completely reorganized. For Japan, a nation with deep cultural memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Fukushima represented a third nuclear trauma. Public opinion turned sharply against nuclear power. All of Japan's nuclear reactors were shut down for safety reviews. Years later, only a fraction have restarted, and nuclear energy's role in Japan's future remains contentious. The disaster forced a fundamental reconsideration of the country's energy policy and its relationship with nuclear technology. Internationally, Fukushima had immediate impacts. Germany decided to phase out nuclear power entirely. Other countries conducted stress tests on their reactors and reviewed tsunami and flooding vulnerabilities. The disaster demonstrated that even advanced nations with strong regulatory systems and excellent engineering weren't immune to catastrophic nuclear accidents. What makes Fukushima particularly significant is that it was a natural disaster triggering a technological catastrophe. The earthquake and tsunami killed nearly 20,000 people, far more than the nuclear accident itself. But the combination of natural disaster and nuclear emergency created unique challenges. Rescue and recovery efforts in tsunami-affected areas near the plant were complicated by radiation concerns. The psychological burden of multiple simultaneous disasters affected how people processed and responded to each threat. Today, the Fukushima Daiichi site remains an active industrial zone, with thousands of workers involved in decommissioning and cleanup. The damaged reactor buildings, patched and reinforced, stand as monuments to the disaster. Spent fuel has been removed from the pools, a process that took years of careful work. The melted fuel remains inside the reactor vessels and containments, awaiting removal techniques that are still being developed. Tour of the site, carefully controlled and with strict radiation monitoring, allowed journalists and officials to witness the ongoing challenge. Some evacuated areas have been decontaminated and reopened, though many former residents choose not to return, either from radiation concerns or because they've built new lives elsewhere. The ghost towns in the evacuation zone. Shops with goods still on shelves, homes with belongings left behind, schools with classrooms frozen in time. Echo Pripyat's abandonment after Chernobyl. Nature is slowly reclaiming these spaces, with wild boar and other animals moving into human-free zones. 25 years separated Chernobyl and Fukushima, yet both disasters demonstrated remarkably similar fundamental issues. The gap between theoretical safety and real-world performance, the importance of organizational culture and regulatory oversight, and the difficulty of managing low-probability but high-consequence risks. The specific causes differed: human error and design flaws versus natural disaster. But the underlying message was the same. Nuclear technology demands constant vigilance, honest assessment of risks, and humility in the face of both human fallibility and natural forces. Sometimes the difference between a minor incident and a catastrophe is measured in seconds, or in the choice of one person, or in sheer luck. The history of nuclear power includes not just the disasters we've explored, but also accidents that came terrifyingly close to similar outcomes, but were, through some combination of skill, fortune, and quick thinking, prevented from escalating. These near misses provide crucial lessons, because they reveal hazards and vulnerabilities before they result in disasters. One of the most significant near misses occurred at the Fermi 1 reactor near Detroit, Michigan, in October 1966. Fermi 1 was an experimental fast breeder reactor, a design meant to produce more fuel than it consumed. On October 5, operators noticed unusual temperature readings. Some fuel assemblies were overheating, though the reactor had been shut down. Alarms indicated trouble, but the instruments weren't providing clear information about what was wrong or where. For several anxious days, operators and engineers tried to understand what had happened inside the reactor vessel. They knew some fuel had melted. About 30% of the core had been damaged, but they couldn't determine why. The reactor had been operating within normal parameters when the problems began. Eventually, after months of investigation and the use of a special periscope to look inside the reactor vessel, they discovered the cause. A piece of zirconium plate, part of the reactor's internal structure, had broken loose and was blocking coolant flow to several fuel assemblies. This was a partial meltdown, similar in some ways to what would later occur at 3 Mile Island. But Fermi 1 was only 30 miles from downtown Detroit. If the accident had progressed to a full meltdown with containment breach, the consequences for a major American city would have been catastrophic. The reactor's location, so close to a large population center, made the accident particularly alarming in retrospect. Fermi 1 eventually restarted, but never operated reliably, and was permanently shut down in 1972. An even more unsettling near-miss occurred at Browns Ferry Nuclear Plant in Alabama on March 22, 1975. A technician was checking for air leaks in a cable penetration area using a candle flame, a technique that sounds absurd in hindsight but was apparently considered acceptable at the time. The flame ignited polyurethane foam used to seal cable penetrations, and the fire spread rapidly through cables connecting to both of the plant's operating reactors. The fire burned for 7 hours, destroying electrical cables that controlled critical safety systems. At one point, the plant came very close to a loss of coolant accident because the fire had damaged so many control systems. Operators had to improvise, using systems in ways they weren't designed for to maintain cooling. If they'd failed, Browns Ferry could have experienced a meltdown. The fact that a technician with a candle nearly caused a major nuclear disaster revealed how seemingly minor procedures could create catastrophic vulnerabilities. The SL-1 accident in Idaho on January 3, 1961, while not a near miss in the sense of being prevented, was significant because it was the only fatal reactor accident in American history. SL-1 was a small military reactor used for training. 3 operators were performing maintenance when, for reasons that remain unclear, all 3 died instantly. They manually withdrew the central control rod far beyond safe limits. The reactor went prompt critical, experiencing a power excursion so rapid and intense that the water coolant explosively vaporized. The explosion was powerful enough to kill all 3 operators. One was impaled by a control rod that pinned him to the ceiling. The radiation levels were so high that it took days before recovery teams could enter the reactor building, and when they did, they could work for only minutes at a time. The bodies were so contaminated that they were buried in lead coffins. The SL-1 accident demonstrated that even small reactors could kill, and it raised troubling questions about the human factors in nuclear operations. What combination of error, procedure violation, or intentional action had led to the rod being withdrawn so far? At the Davis-Besse Nuclear Power Station in Ohio, operators in 2002 discovered a near-catastrophic problem during a routine inspection. The reactor vessel head, the massive steel dome that seals the top of the reactor, had corroded nearly through in one location. Only a thin stainless steel liner, about a 1/4 inch thick, prevented reactor coolant from leaking. If that liner had failed, the plant would have experienced a loss of coolant accident that could have led to core damage. What made Davis-Besse particularly alarming was that the corrosion had been developing for years while the reactor operated, and it wasn't detected until it had nearly caused a disaster. The corrosion was caused by boric acid leaking from control rod penetrations, a known industry issue that hadn't been properly addressed at Davis-Besse. The near miss revealed how degradation could occur gradually, hidden from inspection, until a facility was operating on the edge of catastrophe without anyone realizing it. Criticality accidents, unintended nuclear reactions outside of reactors, have occurred several times, often with fatal results. At Takemura, Japan, in 1999, workers at a fuel processing facility were mixing uranium solution in a way that violated procedures. They added too much uranium to a tank, creating conditions for an uncontrolled nuclear reaction. When the solution went critical, it emitted intense radiation and neutrons. 2 workers standing near the tank received fatal radiation doses. One died within months, the other after an agonizing 7 months despite massive medical intervention. The Takemura accident was particularly disturbing because it resulted from blatant procedure violations. Workers were using buckets to pour uranium solution rather than following the approved process because it was faster. The facility's management had prioritized speed and cost-cutting over safety, and workers were inadequately trained on criticality risks. The accident demonstrated that nuclear safety culture failures could occur even in modern, developed nations. The K-19 Soviet nuclear submarine accident in 1961 represents a different category of nuclear near-disaster. The submarine's nuclear reactor cooling system failed while the sub was on patrol in the North Atlantic. Without cooling, the reactor would overheat and potentially melt down, and if that happened underwater, the results were unpredictable. Worse, K-19 carried nuclear missiles, and a reactor accident could potentially trigger conventional explosions that might set off the missiles. The submarine's crew, including engineers and officers, entered the reactor compartment in shifts to repair the cooling system while exposed to lethal levels of radiation. They worked in conditions of extreme heat and radiation, often with inadequate protection. 8 crew members died within weeks from radiation exposure, and more suffered long-term health effects. But they succeeded in repairing the cooling system and preventing a reactor meltdown that could have caused a massive release of radiation into the ocean, or worse, potentially triggered World War III if Soviet authorities had believed the submarine was under attack. These near misses and accidents share common themes. Many involved procedure violations or shortcuts taken to save time or effort. Several revealed design flaws that weren't apparent until tested by real conditions. Most demonstrated the importance of safety culture. The Browns Ferry fire, the Takemura accident, and Davis-Besse all reflected organizational failures to prioritize safety appropriately. Behind every nuclear disaster, there are people. Not just statistics or radiation dose measurements, but individuals who experienced moments of terror, made impossible choices, showed extraordinary courage, or simply tried to do their jobs under circumstances no training could fully prepare them for. These human stories reveal dimensions of nuclear accidents that technical analyses alone cannot capture. Alexander Akimov was the shift foreman at Chernobyl's Reactor 4 on the night of April 26, 1986. He was 33 years old, experienced, and by all accounts, a conscientious operator who took his responsibilities seriously. When his supervisor, Anatoly Dyatlov, ordered the safety test to proceed despite the reactor being in an unstable state, Akimov expressed concerns. The reactor was operating at much lower power than the test required, many safety systems had been disabled, and the configuration violated operating procedures. But Dyatlov insisted. In the Soviet system, questioning superiors was risky. Dyatlov had a reputation for intimidating subordinates. Akimov followed orders, though witnesses later said he was clearly uncomfortable. When the reactor began to surge out of control, Akimov ordered the emergency shutdown. He pushed the button that should have saved the reactor. Instead, due to the RBMK design flaw, it triggered the catastrophic power spike. In the moments after the explosion, Akimov refused to believe the reactor had been destroyed. He'd worked with RBMK reactors for years and couldn't conceive that the massive structure could simply explode. When others reported seeing graphite and fuel on the ground, he dismissed their observations as impossible. For crucial hours, this disbelief may have delayed appropriate responses. Despite absorbing a massive radiation dose in the first minutes after the explosion, Akimov remained at his post, trying to salvage what he could, attempting to pump water into what he believed was an intact reactor. He and his colleagues worked through the night in conditions of extraordinary radiation, following procedures and trying to prevent further damage. By morning, Akimov was vomiting and showing symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. He was hospitalized, and over the following weeks, his body broke down as radiation destroyed his bone marrow and internal organs. He died on May 11, 1986, 15 days after the accident, one of the first casualties. Akimov's story raises painful questions about authority, responsibility, and the human factors in technological disasters. Was he a hero who stayed at his post despite mortal danger? A victim of a hierarchical system that discouraged questioning orders? Someone who made errors in judgment that contributed to the disaster? Perhaps he was all of these. A complex person caught in impossible circumstances, doing his best with incomplete information and training that hadn't prepared him for the unthinkable. Lyudmila Ignatenko was 23 years old and pregnant when her husband Vasily, a firefighter, responded to the fire at Chernobyl. Vasily was one of the first responders who climbed onto the roof of the turbine hall, where pieces of ejected reactor core were burning. He and his colleagues threw these pieces off the roof with their bare hands, not understanding they were handling material thousands of times more radioactive than safe levels. By morning, Vasily was vomiting and experiencing severe headaches. He was evacuated to Moscow for treatment. Lyudmila, desperate to be with him, used connections to get to Moscow despite being told she couldn't visit due to the radiation danger. What she saw in the hospital was devastating. Her husband was burning from the inside out, his body breaking down from radiation that had destroyed his cellular structure. The doctors told her not to touch him, not to go near him, that he was dangerously radioactive. She ignored them. She held his hand, kissed him, cared for him as his condition deteriorated. Vasily died on May 13, 2 weeks after his exposure. 4 months later, Lyudmila gave birth to a daughter who lived only a few hours, dying from cirrhosis of the liver and heart damage. The doctors suggested that Lyudmila had absorbed radiation from Vasily's body, and that this had affected her baby. Lyudmila's story, told powerfully in Svetlana Alexievich's oral history, Voices from Chernobyl, reveals the human cost beyond statistics. It shows love persisting in the face of radiation, the impossible choices families faced, and the way the disaster rippled through lives in ways that casualty counts can't capture. It also reveals the ethical complexities. Should Lyudmila have been allowed to expose herself? Should love trump radiation safety? These are questions without easy answers. Valery Kodenchuk was an operator on duty at Reactor 4 when it exploded. He was in the pump rooms at the moment of the explosion and was killed instantly, likely by the blast itself or immediate radiation exposure. His body was never recovered. It remains entombed somewhere in the ruins of Reactor 4, beneath the sarcophagus and now the new safe confinement. He was 35 years old. Kodenchuk's fate is a stark reminder that some victims of nuclear disasters simply vanish, their bodies too radioactive or too inaccessible to recover. He left behind a wife and young son. There's no grave to visit, no place to mourn except the massive structure that contains the destroyed reactor. In a sense, the entire Chernobyl complex is his tomb. At 3 Mile Island, operator Craig Faust was on duty when the accident began. Years later, he described the chaos in the control room as alarms sounded, indicators gave contradictory information, and the crew tried desperately to understand what was happening. He described the moment when they realized the reactor core was uncovered and melting. The sickening understanding that they were facing every nuclear operator's nightmare scenario. What haunted Faust wasn't just the technical aspects, but the human dimensions. He thought about the people living nearby. He wondered if the accident would hurt his family and neighbors. He grappled with questions about whether he and his colleagues had made the right decisions, whether they could have prevented the core damage if they'd understood the situation more quickly. The psychological burden of being part of America's worst nuclear accident affected him for years. Faust's experience highlights something often overlooked in nuclear accidents. The operators themselves are victims too. They're trained to prevent disasters, they take pride in running safe facilities, and when accidents occur despite their best efforts, they carry guilt and trauma alongside whatever radiation exposure they received. Many 3 Mile Island operators faced public anger, investigations, and their own internal questioning of every decision made during those critical hours. Masao Yoshida was the plant manager at Fukushima Daiichi when the earthquake and tsunami struck. In the days that followed, he faced impossible decisions with incomplete information while Japan watched on television, and the world wondered if a catastrophe worse than Chernobyl was unfolding. Yoshida had to decide whether to abandon the plant or keep workers there despite rising radiation. He had to choose between procedures and improvisation when systems failed. He ordered seawater pumped into the reactors, knowing this would permanently destroy them because it was the only option. At one critical point, Yoshida faced a potential mutiny. About 650 of the roughly 800 workers at the plant evacuated to Fukushima Daiichi, another nuclear facility about 10 kilometers away. Either misunderstanding orders or deciding the risk was too great. Yoshida was left with about 50 workers, the Fukushima 50, who would become symbols of dedication and sacrifice. Yoshida could have evacuated entirely. Instead, he and those who remained continued fighting to control the disaster. Yoshida died in 2013 from esophageal cancer. The type of cancer he developed is not typically associated with radiation exposure, and doctors concluded it was unrelated to Fukushima. But the stress he endured certainly affected his health. He gave hundreds of hours of testimony about the accident, providing crucial insights into what happened and why. In his testimony, he was remarkably candid about mistakes, uncertainties, and moments when he simply didn't know what to do. This honesty contributed more to nuclear safety than any number of sanitized official reports could have. The liquidators at Chernobyl, the hundreds of thousands of people who cleaned up the disaster, each have their own stories. Some were soldiers ordered to participate. Others were reservists called up. Some volunteered, motivated by patriotism, duty, or simply the bonuses and privileges offered. Many were young men who didn't fully understand what they were being exposed to. Boris Stalyarchuk was a soldier assigned to the roof of Reactor 3, next to the destroyed Reactor 4. His job was to shovel radioactive graphite and debris off the roof and throw it into the destroyed reactor hall. The radiation was so intense that workers could only spend 40 seconds to 2 minutes on the roof before absorbing their lifetime maximum permissible dose. They'd run out, perform their task as quickly as possible, and run back, knowing they'd just used up their radiation allowance for the rest of their lives in less time than it takes to make coffee. Stalyarchuk described the surreal nature of the work. The debris glowing in places, the need to move quickly while wearing heavy protective gear in intense heat, the knowledge that invisible radiation was damaging your body with each second. He described the dark humor among the liquidators, the vodka that many believed, incorrectly, offered radiation protection, and the sense of duty that kept them working despite the fear. Years later, he developed health problems he attributed to his exposure, but he expressed pride in what the liquidators accomplished, feeling they'd prevented an even worse disaster. Children who were exposed to radiation from these disasters carry their own stories. Alha Serdiuk was 5 years old and living in northern Ukraine when Chernobyl exploded. She remembered playing outside in what she later learned was radioactive dust. She remembered the sudden evacuation, leaving her toys and home behind. She remembered confusion and fear, not understanding why adults were scared or what radiation meant. Years later, she was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, one of thousands of cases among children exposed to radioactive iodine from Chernobyl. She underwent surgery and treatment, recovered, but faced lifelong health monitoring and the knowledge that she'd been affected by an accident she was too young to understand when it occurred. Her childhood was fractured into before and after Chernobyl, a division that defined her life in ways large and small. The human element in nuclear disasters also includes those who studied the aftermath. Robert Gale, an American physician, volunteered to help treat Chernobyl victims in Moscow. He performed bone marrow transplants, trying to save firefighters and operators whose bone marrow had been destroyed by radiation. Most of his patients died anyway. Radiation damage was too severe, too systemic. But Gale described the experience as transformative, seeing the human cost of radiation exposure in the most intimate way possible. He described holding the hands of dying young men, translating between Soviet doctors and patients, and grappling with the ethical questions of treatment. Was it ethical to perform experimental procedures on dying patients? Was extending their lives by days or weeks while they suffered intense pain a kindness or cruelty? These questions had no clear answers, but they revealed the human dimensions of radiation casualties that statistics obscure. The evacuees from Fukushima faced their own challenges. Many left their homes thinking they'd return in days or weeks. Years later, they're still displaced, living in temporary housing or relocated to other cities. Elderly evacuees in particular struggled with the loss of community, the disruption of routine, and the psychological toll of displacement. Some chose to return to contaminated zones despite radiation risks, deciding that spending their remaining years in familiar surroundings was worth more than the hypothetical reduction in cancer risk from staying away. Farmers in the Fukushima region faced the destruction of their livelihoods and their identity. Families had farmed the same land for generations. The soil itself was part of their heritage. When that soil became contaminated, when their products couldn't be sold, when their life's work became worthless, the psychological impact was devastating. Some took their own lives. Others struggled with depression and loss of purpose. The radiation didn't just contaminate land. It contaminated meaning, identity, and belonging. What these human stories reveal is that nuclear disasters aren't just technical events. They're profound human traumas that ripple through individuals, families, and communities in ways that persist for generations. The radiation exposure is measurable and quantifiable. The psychological and social damage is harder to measure, but no less real. When the immediate crisis of a nuclear disaster ends, when the fires are extinguished and the reactor stabilized, a different kind of challenge begins. Living with radiation's long-term consequences. These consequences play out over decades and even generations, affecting health, ecosystems, and the relationship between communities and the land they call home. The most studied health effect of radiation exposure is cancer. Ionizing radiation damages DNA, and while cells have repair mechanisms, these sometimes make errors, leading to mutations that can trigger cancer years or decades after exposure. The most clearly established cancer from nuclear accidents is thyroid cancer, particularly in children exposed to radioactive iodine. After Chernobyl, thyroid cancer rates in children from affected areas of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia increased dramatically. Normally, thyroid cancer in children is extremely rare, perhaps 1 or 2 cases per million children per year. In the most contaminated areas after Chernobyl, rates increased to several dozen cases per million. By the early 2000s, over 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer had been documented in people who were children at the time of the accident. The mechanism is well understood. Radioactive iodine-131, released in large quantities at Chernobyl, concentrates in the thyroid gland, which uses iodine to produce hormones. Children's thyroid glands are particularly susceptible. They're smaller, more active, and still developing. When radioactive iodine deposits in the thyroid, it delivers a concentrated dose of radiation that can damage thyroid cells and trigger cancer. Most of these cancers are treatable. The survival rate for thyroid cancer is generally very good, but treatment requires surgery, often removal of the entire thyroid, followed by lifelong hormone replacement therapy. For children who underwent these procedures, the cancer represents a permanent mark from Chernobyl, a daily reminder in the pills they must take for the rest of their lives. What's grimly instructive is that thyroid cancer after Chernobyl was preventable. If children in affected areas had been given potassium iodide tablets immediately after the accident, their thyroid glands would have been saturated with safe iodine and wouldn't have absorbed the radioactive version. This is why potassium iodide distribution is now a standard emergency planning measure near nuclear facilities. But in 1986, this wasn't done in the Soviet Union, partly from lack of preparation, and partly because officials delayed acknowledging the scale of the disaster. Other cancers are harder to attribute definitively to radiation exposure. Leukemia, breast cancer, and lung cancer can all result from radiation, but they also have many other causes. Determining whether a specific case was caused by radiation exposure versus some other factor is often impossible for individual patients. Epidemiologists instead look at population-level statistics, comparing cancer rates in exposed populations to unexposed control groups. These studies face methodological challenges. Populations affected by nuclear accidents often experience other stresses, displacement, economic hardship, psychological trauma, that themselves affect health. Detecting small increases in cancer rates requires studying large populations over long periods. And the very trauma of the accident can create screening and detection bias, where exposed populations receive more medical monitoring, and thus have cancers detected that might otherwise go unnoticed. The most authoritative studies estimate that Chernobyl may eventually cause up to 4,000 additional cancer deaths among the most exposed populations. This is a tragic number, but it's also surprisingly small compared to the tens of thousands who died from the earthquake and tsunami that triggered the Fukushima accident, or compared to the routine health costs of fossil fuel pollution. This doesn't minimize the suffering of those affected, but it provides perspective on the actual versus perceived risks. One fear that nuclear disasters evoke is genetic damage, mutations passed to future generations. Studies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors who received radiation doses far higher than most nuclear accident victims haven't found clear evidence of increased genetic defects in their children. Radiation can damage DNA in reproductive cells, but evolution has equipped us with robust mechanisms for repairing this damage, and cells with severe damage typically don't result in viable pregnancies. Studies of children born to Chernobyl liquidators and exposed populations have similarly failed to find clear evidence of inherited genetic damage. This is genuinely surprising to many people, because popular understanding of radiation often includes the idea of genetic damage persisting through generations. The scientific reality appears to be that while radiation can cause genetic mutations, most of these either prevent conception, result in early miscarriage, or are repaired by cellular mechanisms. This doesn't mean there are no effects. Detecting subtle increases in genetic defects requires very large studies and long time periods. But the dramatic multi-generational genetic catastrophes sometimes portrayed in media haven't materialized. The radiation legacy appears to affect primarily those directly exposed, not their descendants. The environmental impact of nuclear disasters is complex and often counterintuitive. The Chernobyl exclusion zone, evacuated of humans, has become an accidental wildlife preserve. Animals don't live long enough for cancer to develop, and radiation's effects on populations are less significant than the benefit of removing human hunting, habitat destruction, and disturbance. Wolves, bears, lynx, bison, and endangered species thrive in the zone, despite radiation levels that would be unacceptable for human habitation. This doesn't mean radiation has no environmental effects. Some organisms, particularly those at the top of food chains, accumulate radioactive isotopes. Trees in the most contaminated areas grew more slowly. Insect populations showed abnormalities. but overall ecosystem health in the exclusion zone is remarkably good, better in many ways than comparable areas with human habitation. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Human presence is often more damaging to ecosystems than moderate levels of radiation. The forests around Chernobyl do show one unique effect. They're accumulating dead organic matter rather than decomposing normally. The radiation has affected the microorganisms and fungi that break down fallen leaves and dead wood. This creates unusual fire risk and changes nutrient cycling, though the long-term implications aren't fully understood. In the ocean around Fukushima, radioactive isotopes entered the marine ecosystem. Fish caught near the plant showed contamination levels above safe limits for human consumption. Over time, these levels have generally decreased as short-lived isotopes decayed and others were diluted. Long-term monitoring continues, but the ocean's vast dilution capacity has prevented the widespread contamination some feared. Still, fishing restrictions remain in place in some areas, and psychological impacts on fishing communities persist even where fish are technically safe. The psychological and social legacy of radiation may ultimately exceed the physical health impacts. Living in contaminated areas, even at levels technically considered safe, creates constant stress. Parents worry about their children playing outdoors. Farmers question whether their land will ever be trusted again. Communities fracture over disagreements about risk and safety, with some people insisting areas are safe while others refuse to return regardless of official statements. The displacement from contaminated areas itself creates health impacts. Elderly people forced to evacuate from familiar communities showed higher rates of depression, decline in physical health, and mortality. The stress of displacement, the loss of social networks, and the difficulty of adapting to new environments affected health more than low-level radiation exposure would have. This raises difficult ethical questions about when evacuation causes more harm than the contamination it's meant to protect against. Trust in institutions is a radiation legacy that's hard to quantify but profoundly important. When governments minimize dangers, provide contradictory information, or are later proven to have withheld truth, public trust erodes in ways that persist for generations. After Chernobyl, surveys showed lasting cynicism about official statements and institutions. After Fukushima, confidence in nuclear regulators and power companies plummeted. This erosion of trust affects not just nuclear issues, but government credibility more broadly. Economic impacts ripple through affected regions for decades. Property values near nuclear disaster sites drop and recover slowly, if at all. Industries dependent on area reputation, tourism, agriculture, fishing, suffer even when contamination is minimal. The Chernobyl brand became globally associated with disaster, affecting how products from the region were perceived. Similarly, Fukushima became shorthand for nuclear catastrophe, damaging the prefecture's reputation for products and produce that were actually safe. The cleanup and decommissioning costs of nuclear disasters are staggering and extend over generations. The Chernobyl cleanup involved hundreds of thousands of workers over decades and continues today. Fukushima's cleanup is expected to cost over $200 billion and won't be complete until mid-century at earliest. These costs affect national budgets, energy policy, and economic development in ways that persist long after the immediate crisis ends. Some communities near disaster sites have developed complex relationships with contamination. In the Chernobyl zone, a few hundred elderly people returned illegally to their ancestral villages, choosing familiar contaminated land over displacement. They tend gardens, maintain homes, and live lives that by technical radiation standards are unsafe, but which they find preferable to exile. For them, the psychological and social benefits of returning home outweigh radiation risks they may not live long enough to manifest. Research in affected areas has provided valuable scientific understanding of radiation's long-term effects. Studies of Chernobyl and Fukushima populations contribute to radiation medicine, environmental science, and our understanding of how ecosystems respond to contamination. This knowledge, purchased at terrible cost, helps prepare for future accidents and informs safety standards. The affected populations have unwittingly become subjects in long-term studies that will continue for decades. One surprising finding from radiation research is that very low doses may have effects different from what simple extrapolation from higher doses would suggest. Some studies hint at threshold effects, where very low radiation might not increase cancer risk at all, or might even stimulate protective cellular responses. This remains controversial, and the scientific consensus is conservative, assuming any radiation dose carries some risk. But the uncertainty reveals how much we still don't fully understand about radiation's biological effects. The legacy of nuclear disasters also includes changed landscapes that will remain marked for millennia. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,000 years. Areas contaminated with plutonium will remain radioactive for geological timescales. While the radiation level decreases over time, these sites represent humanity's longest-lasting marks on the environment. Longer lasting than our buildings, our art, perhaps even our species. Tonight, we've journeyed through the atomic age, from the first artificial nuclear reaction in the New Mexico desert to the ongoing challenges of living with radiation's legacy. We've explored disasters hidden by secrecy, fires that nearly became catastrophes, meltdowns that changed nations, and the moment when nature's power overwhelmed human technology. The nuclear disasters we've explored teach us that invisible dangers require visible vigilance. That secrecy in the name of avoiding panic often creates worse outcomes. That nature can overwhelm even sophisticated technology. And that the psychological impacts of radiation may ultimately exceed the physical ones. They remind us that technological power and human wisdom don't always advance at the same pace, and that some mistakes carry consequences measured not in years, but in generations. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the atomic age and its darkest moments. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you find comfort in the visible world around you, trust in human capacity for learning from tragedy, and peace in knowing that those who came before us paid dearly for lessons that make the world safer for those who follow.